They called her Beacon, a name whispered in the shadow of mountains, earned in a tragedy no one could forget. Lila Marrow walked into Iron Ridge with scars that told stories she wouldn't share. Mocked, doubted, she stood silent, but her past roared louder than their jeers. In one moment, everything flipped, a truth so raw it silenced a room. Who was she really? Why did she return to a place that broke her? What drives someone to face disaster again when they've already lost everything? Stick around to find out, and if this story grabs you, hit that like button, share it with a friend, and drop your thoughts below. It's what keeps us going. The wind howled through Iron Ridge, carrying red dust that stung like regret. Lila Marrow stepped into the rescue station's warehouse, her boots grinding against the grit-covered floor. Her jacket was stained with mud, her hair a tangled mess, and a jagged scar snaked from her wrist up her forearm, catching the flicker of fluorescent lights. Tanner Holt, all muscle and arrogance, stood among the volunteers, his voice slicing through the clatter of gear like a blade through canvas. "New girl looks like she just crawled out of a ditch," he drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's with the scar? Marrow? Lose a fight with a bear." Laughter erupted, sharp and cruel, bouncing off the walls. Heads turned, eyes narrowed, sizing her up. Lila was the outsider here, the only woman on this season's crew, dropped into a team that didn't want her. Whispers had spread the night before. Some said she'd failed her last mission. Others figured she was just a token hire. Holt stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her small frame. "What's the matter, Beacon?" he sneered, the nickname dripping with mockery. "Forget how to talk after your little vacation?" That word, Beacon, hit her like a stone. It hadn't been spoken in years, not since Crimson Gorge, not since the screams drowned in mud. Lila's eyes flicked up, locking onto his, steady, unyielding. She didn't speak, didn't flinch. Her silence wasn't weakness. It was a wall, and it burned Holt more than any comeback could. The volunteers chuckled, their laughter a test, probing for cracks. They didn't know her, didn't care to. But in that moment, under the weight of their stares, Lila stood like someone who'd faced worse than their words, and walked away carrying the ghost to prove it. The air in the Iron Ridge warehouse hung heavy, thick with the scent of damp rope and engine oil. Lila Marrow stood where she'd been left, her scar a stark line under the buzzing lights. Her silence a challenge no one expected. Tanner Holt wasn't done. He sauntered through the scattered volunteers, their eyes darting between him and the woman who hadn't budged. He snatched a coiled rescue line from a crate and tossed it at her feet, the rope skidding just shy of her boots. "Pick it up, Marrow," he said, his grin sharp as a splinter. "Unless your hands shake too much to tie a knot these days." The volunteers snickered, their laughter low and jagged, testing her edges. Lila crouched, her movements slow, deliberate, fingers grazing the rough nylon. For a heartbeat, her mind slipped to a rain-soaked gorge, to hands slipping from hers, to a scream swallowed by mud. She rose, rope in hand, and set it back on the crate, her gaze never leaving Holt's. Not a word. That only stoked him further. He leaned in, his voice dropping, meant just for her. "Heard you froze out there, Beacon. What was it? Too much dirt for the big hero." The nickname twisted like a blade, but Lila's face stayed stone. From the shadowed doorway, Chief Marion Caldwell watched, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. She knew the weight of that name, knew the gorge it was carved from. She'd seen the reports, the ones no one else had. Lila's hands didn't shake, not anymore, but Caldwell stayed still, letting the moment simmer. The volunteers shifted, their chuckles fading into something uneasy. Holt's taunts were bold, but Lila's silence was bolder, a wall he couldn't crack. Her scar caught the light, a reminder of something they couldn't guess, and in that quiet, she stood like someone who'd faced worse than a loudmouth and walked away with wounds that didn't show. The warehouse at Iron Ridge buzzed with tension, the air thick as the dust that clung to every surface. Lila Marrow stood rooted, her scar a silent testament under the flickering lights, her defiance woven into the quiet she wore like armor. Tanner Holt's grin faltered, his last jab hanging unanswered the volunteers' laughter thinning into uneasy murmurs. Then, a sharp creak cut through, boots on the wooden floor. Chief Marion Caldwell stepped from the shadowed doorway, her presence like a storm rolling over the peaks. Her voice, low and rough as gravel, stopped every rustle cold. "Beacon," she said, her eyes piercing Lilas. "That's what they called her. And you just threw mud on it, Holt." The room stilled, breaths held, tools forgotten and hands gone slack. Even the mountain winds outside seemed to pause. Holt blinked, his bravado cracking, voice half laughing, half lost. "Beacon? What's that mean, Chief?" "Some old nickname." Caldwell didn't flinch. Her steps were slow, deliberate, each one a hammer striking stone as she closed the gap to Holt. "You don't know who you're mocking, son. That's Beacon, the one who walked into Crimson Gorge and came out carrying more than you could lift in a lifetime." The name landed like a thunderclap. Beacon, Crimson Gorge. Whispers sparked among the volunteers, their eyes darting to Lila, searching for truth in her weathered frame. Some knew the stories, fragments of a rescuer who defied a collapsing canyon, who pulled lives from a flood's jaws. But that was a myth, a tale spun in the dark of sleepless nights. Not this woman, with her tired eyes and scarred arm. Could it be? Lila stood unchanged, her silhouette sharp against the open door, the mountain shadow framing her like a warning. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Caldwell's words reshaped the air, heavy with a truth that pressed against every chest. Holt's shoulders stiffened, his smirk gone, replaced by something raw, uncertain. The volunteers leaned closer, their doubt shifting, questions flickering in their glances. Lila's scar gleamed faintly, a mark of something they couldn't yet grasp. And in that frozen moment, the warehouse felt smaller, the world sharper, as if the mountains themselves were listening. The Iron Ridge warehouse held its breath, Chief Caldwell's words still echoing like a distant landslide. Lila Marrow stood motionless, her scar a stark line against the dim light. Her silence louder than the murmurs now rippling through the volunteers. The name Beacon hung heavy, a spark igniting whispers in the dusty air. In the corner, Riley Kane, her red hair catching the glow, leaned toward a fellow volunteer, voice hushed but urgent. "Beacon? From Crimson Gorge? No way that's her." Her eyes widened, searching Lila's frame for proof of the legend. Another volunteer, grizzled and skeptical, shook his head, his voice a low mutter. "Can't be. That rescuer's long gone. Quit or buried. No one walks out a place like that." Tanner Holt forced a laugh, his bravado a thin mask now, fraying at the edges. "What? She's some kind of saint now. Looks more like she's running from something." But his words lacked bite, his gaze flickering to Lila, uncertain, as if seeing her for the first time. She didn't move, her silhouette framed by the open door, the jagged peaks beyond casting shadows that seemed to guard her. The volunteers' whispers grew, fragmented tales of Crimson Gorge surfacing, stories of a woman who climbed through a collapsing canyon, who defied a flood to save lives. Kane's voice dropped lower, almost reverent. "I heard she pulled a whole family out, tied them to her own rope while the cliffs fell apart." Another volunteer nodded, eyes narrowing, doubt warring with awe. Holt shifted, his hands balling into fists, his earlier swagger dulled by the weight of what he'd heard. Lila's presence, quiet and unyielding, seemed to pull the room toward her. Her scar a map of truths they couldn't yet read. From the sidelines, a younger volunteer, Ezra, clutched a harness, his usual slouch gone, his gaze fixed on her. The air crackled with something new. Not just doubt, but the first threads of recognition, fragile and unspoken. Lila's eyes stayed steady, locked somewhere beyond the room, as if the mountains themselves held her secrets. The volunteers' glances darted between her and Holt, their voices softening, their skepticism bending under the pressure of Caldwell's revelation. In that moment, the warehouse felt alive, the dust settling like a veil over a truth just beginning to surface, and Lila stood at its center, not as an outsider, but as something else, something they weren't ready to name. The Iron Ridge warehouse stood frozen, the volunteers' whispers fading under the weight of Chief Marion Caldwell's words. Lila Marrow remained still, her scar a raw line in the dim light, her silence a wall no one could breach. Caldwell faced Tanner Holt, her gaze unyielding, voice steady as the granite peaks outside. 2 years ago, Crimson Gorge, she began, each word heavy, deliberate, like stones dropped into a silent pool. A family of 6, trapped in a canyon during a flash flood. Cliffs crumbling, mudslides tearing through. No team could reach them, too unstable, they said. Command called it hopeless. The volunteers leaned closer, their breath shallow, eyes darting between Caldwell and Lila. But one rescuer didn't listen. Beacon, Lila Marrow. The name landed like a spark in dry grass. Lila's hands tightened, her nails biting into her palms, but her face stayed stone. Caldwell's voice pressed on, calm but relentless. She took a harness, no backup, no safety line, climbed down a 200-foot cliff, mud and rock raining around her. The family was in a cave, water rising fast, their screams barely audible over the flood's roar. Lila got to them, tied each one to a rope, pulled them up one by one as the gorge collapsed. The room was silent. The volunteers' earlier doubts, now fragile, cracking under the story's weight. She moved like the mountain itself was against her. Caldwell continued, her eyes flicking to Lila. Rocks tore her arm open, but she didn't stop. 5 made it out, a mother, her kids, and uncle. The last, a girl, didn't. The cliff gave way, and Lila couldn't hold her. A faint tremor crossed Lila's jaw, almost invisible, but the volunteers nearest her caught it. The air grew heavier, the warehouse walls seeming to close in. Caldwell's voice softened, not out of pity, but respect. She climbed back up, blood soaking her gear, carrying the one she saved. No one else could have done it. No one else tried. The volunteers stood rooted, some staring at Lila, others at the floor, as if the truth was too much to hold. Holt's hands hung loose, his earlier bravado buried under the image of a woman fighting a dying canyon. Kane's eyes glistened, her breath uneven, while Ezra gripped his harness tighter, his knuckles white. Lila's scar seemed to pulse in the light, a mark of what she'd endured, what she'd lost. The story wasn't just a tale. It was a wound, still raw, and in that moment, the volunteers began to see her, not as the stranger they'd mocked, but as someone who'd walked through hell and carried its weight ever since. The Iron Ridge warehouse quivered, Chief Caldwell's words about Beacon still ringing like a bell struck in the dark. Lila Marrow stood rooted, her scar a faint shadow against the dim glow, her silence a magnet pulling every eye. The volunteers' murmurs stirred, their earlier jeers now dust in the wind. Riley Kane, red hair flashing under the lights, froze, her hand hovering over a rope coil. Beacon? Crimson Gorge? She whispered, voice sharp with disbelief, eyes searching Lila's frame for the legend. A grizzled volunteer, face weathered as the cliffs, scoffed low. No way. That rescuer's gone. Quit or dead. Nobody walks out of that. Tanner Holt kicked a crate, his laugh forced brittle. What? She's a hero now? Looks like she's hiding from something. But his voice cracked, his gaze darting to Lila, unsteady, as if she'd shifted shape before him. She didn't flinch, her silhouette carved against the open door, the mountain's jagged edge framing her like a warning. Whispers flickered, fragments of Crimson Gorge, a woman who climbed through a dying canyon, saving lives against a flood's wrath. Kane's fingers tightened on the rope, her breath catching, edging out doubt. Ezra, the wiry kid, dropped his harness with a soft thud, his slouch gone. Eyes locked on Lila, bright with something new. Holt's fists clenched, his swagger fading, his kick at the crate a weak echo of his earlier bravado. The air crackled, charged with a truth breaking through. Lila's gaze stayed fixed beyond the room, as if the peaks held her secrets. No words, no need. Her scar, her stillness, drew the volunteers closer, not in body, but in understanding. Kane's hand stilled, her eyes tracing Lila's arm, seeing more than a mark. Ezra stepped forward, just a half step, his usual fidgeting buried under a spark of respect. The whispers softened, the volunteers' doubt bending, their glances no longer mocking but questioning. The warehouse pulsed, alive with a shift no one could name yet. Lila stood, not as the stranger they'd taunted, but as something heavier, a figure forged in a storm they couldn't imagine, her silence louder than their words. Her presence a challenge they were only beginning to grasp. The Iron Ridge warehouse pulsed with a quiet intensity, Chief Marion Caldwell's tale of Crimson Gorge settling like dust after a quake. Lila Marrow stood unwavering, her scar a stark etch in a dim light, her silence a force that held the volunteers captive. Their eyes, once sharp with doubt, now wavered, caught in the gravity of her past. Caldwell turned from Tanner Holt, her gaze sweeping the room, voice firm as the mountains beyond. "You think she's here because she cracked?" she asked, each word a challenge. "You think we pulled her back to fill a slot?" Lila Marrow could have walked away. Full clearance, no questions, a life free of this grind. The volunteers shifted, their breath shallow, as Caldwell's eyes locked on Lila. She didn't. She chose to return. To Iron Ridge. To train you all for the kind of disasters that break most folks. The words hit like a gust through the peaks, stirring something raw. Riley Kane's jaw slackened, her awe deepening into something heavier. Ezra, the wiry kid, blinked hard, as if the truth had rewritten his thoughts. Holt's hands unclenched, his earlier swagger buried under a story too real to shrug off. Caldwell's voice sharpened, not louder, but piercing. "She's not here for your applause. She's here because she knows what happens when you're not ready, when you falter, when you lose someone in the dark." The warehouse felt smaller, the air thick with the weight of her words. Lila stood unchanged, her scar catching the light, her posture a testament to battles fought and carried. The volunteers' earlier jeers seemed distant now, childish against the truth of Crimson Gorge. Kane's eyes flicked to Lila, tracing the scar that told of a cliff's betrayal. Ezra's grip on his harness loosened, his shoulders squaring as if in quiet salute. Holt looked away, his jaw tight, no trace of his old grin. Caldwell stepped closer to Lila, her voice softening, but only just. "She asked for the hardest post we've got, training you to face what she did, to save what she couldn't." The room was still, the volunteers caught in a moment that demanded more than silence. Lila's gaze stayed fixed, somewhere beyond the walls, as if seeing the gorge, the flood, the faces she'd saved and the one she hadn't. Her hands, steady now, bore the faint tremble of memory, but her stance held firm. The volunteers saw it, not weakness, but a strength forged in loss, a choice to stand again where others would have run. In that charged air, the warehouse became a crucible, forging something new, not just respect, but a recognition that Lila wasn't just a rescuer. She was a beacon, burning still, here to light the way for those who'd face the storm next. The Iron Ridge warehouse hummed with a quiet weight, Chief Caldwell's words about Lila Marrow's return settling like frost on stone. Lila stood firm, her scar a faint shadow in the dim glow, her presence a beacon drawing every eye. The volunteers' earlier mockery lay buried, their gazes softer, heavy with a truth they couldn't unsee. Tanner Holt lingered at the edge, hands deep in his pockets, his jaw tight, no trace of his old smirk. A low creak cut the silence. Amos, the grizzled climber, stepped forward, his weathered hand raised in a quiet salute to Lila. Not out of duty, but instinct. Others moved, a slow ripple. Ezra, the wiry kid, set his harness down with a soft clunk, his slouch gone, eyes bright with unspoken respect. Riley Kane tucked a strand of red hair back, her fingers steady, her nod to Lila firm, deliberate. Not all joined. Some hesitated, but enough did, their steps shifting the air. The warehouse, once sharp with taunts, now pulsed with a reverence that spoke louder than words. Lila didn't stir, her scar barely visible, her posture as unyielding as the peaks outside. She didn't need to acknowledge the change. The air carried it, a current easing the weight she'd borne since arriving. Holt stayed back, his shadow long, his silence a crack in his defiance. Kane's hand rested on her harness, grounding her in Lila's story. Ezra stood taller, his gaze fixed, a spark of purpose kindled. The volunteers' doubts, once loud, now crumbled under the reality of Crimson Gorge, of a woman who'd faced a collapsing canyon and returned. The air felt alive, the warehouse a forge shaping something new. Lila's stillness wasn't pride. It was resolve, carved from loss, carried without noise. Her scar, her quiet, her steady stance said more than any shout. And the volunteers felt it, in a way Amos's salute lingered, in a way Kane's nod held steady. The moment wasn't grand, but it was deep, a pivot where scorn turned to recognition. Lila stood, not as the outsider they'd mocked, but as a force they were only beginning to grasp, ready to lead them through storms yet to come. Twilight draped Iron Ridge, the dining hall alive with the soft clatter of plates and murmured voices, a rhythm as steady as the mountain winds outside. Lila Marrow sat alone at a corner table, her untouched meal cooling, her gaze lost in the fogged window where the peaks loomed like silent sentinels. Her scar, barely visible in the low light, traced a story no one had dared to ask. The volunteers, their earlier jeers now ghosts, moved through the hall, their glances flickering toward her, hesitant, weighted with the truth of Crimson Gorge. Then a quiet scrape, a chair pulled back. Riley Kane, her red hair catching the lamplight, slid into the seat across from Lila, her tray rattling faintly. No words, just a nod, her eyes steady, not with pity, but with something deeper earned. Another chair creaked. Ezra, the wiry kid, settled beside her, his usual fidgeting stilled, his gaze flicking to Lila, then away, as if respecting a boundary he couldn't see. Two more followed, their steps slow, deliberate, their trays landing softly on the table. The hall's hum softened, heads turning, but no one spoke. The volunteers sat, ate, their movements careful, their eyes occasionally meeting Lila's, not demanding, but acknowledging. She didn't look up, her fork idle, her posture unchanged, but the air around her shifted, warmer, like a fire kindled in the dark. Tanner Holt lingered at the room's edge, his shadow long against the wall, his hands still in his pockets. He didn't join them, but he didn't leave, his eyes fixed on the table, caught in a struggle he hadn't voiced. The volunteer's silence wasn't empty. It was full, heavy with recognition, a bridge built without fanfare. Kane's fingers brushed her mug, her breath steady, her presence a quiet vow. Ezra chewed slowly, his glances at Lila brief but intent, as if memorizing her strength. The others, newer faces, mirrored them, their silence a language of respect, forged in the warehouse's truth. Lila's scar seemed softer in the lamplight, less a wound, more a mark of what she'd carried through the gorge and beyond. The dining hall, once a place of routine, became something else, a space where walls fell, where a stranger became known. No apologies were offered, none needed. The volunteers' choice to sit, to stay, spoke louder than words, a testament to the woman who'd faced a collapsing canyon and returned to teach them how to face their own. In that moment, Lila wasn't alone, not anymore, and the quiet around her table held a strength as enduring as the mountains outside. The Iron Ridge dining hall glowed faintly, its warmth a fragile shield against the mountain's endless chill. Lila Marrow sat at the corner table, her untouched plate a quiet companion, her scar softened by the lamplight's touch. The volunteers around her, Riley Kane, Isra, and the others, ate in reverent silence, their presence a wordless bond forged in the warehouse's truth. Their eyes, once sharp with doubt, now carried a quiet awe, their glances toward Lila not of pity, but of understanding. The air held a stillness, heavy with the weight of Crimson Gorge, of a woman who'd climbed through chaos and returned to guide them. Kane shifted, her red hair catching the light, her courage stirring. She leaned forward, voice barely a whisper, as if the question itself were sacred. "Why Beacon, Lila? Why do they call you that?" The table froze, forks pausing, breaths held. Lila's gaze stayed on her plate, her scar a faint shadow in the glow. For a moment, she was back in the gorge, rain pounding, hands slipping, a child's scream fading into mud. Then she spoke, her voice low, steady, like a confession carved in stone. "Because I was their light," she said, "and I couldn't save them all." The words fell like stones into a silent pool, rippling through the volunteers. Kane's eyes dropped, her throat tight, the weight of loss sinking deep. Ezra's jaw clenched, his gaze fixed on the table, as if seeing the gorgeous shadow. The others sat motionless, the truth too raw to touch. Lila's scar seemed to pulse, a mark not just of survival, but of a debt she carried alone. The dining hall shrank, the world quieter, the mountains outside, standing witness to her words. No one pressed further, no need. Her answer was a window into a soul that had faced the flood and chosen to return, not for glory, but for those still lost in the dark. The volunteers saw her now, not the myth, not the scar, but the woman who'd burned bright enough to save lives, and carried the ones she couldn't like stones in her chest. Tanner Holt, still at the room's edge, shifted, his shadow softer now, his silence a step toward something new. The table's quiet wasn't heavy. It was sacred, a moment where respect became more than a word. Lila lifted her fork, her movement slow, and took a bite, the act grounding her in the present. The volunteers followed, their silence a vow, their presence a promise to learn from the woman who'd lit the way through hell and stood ready to do it again.